Welcome to Honey Peach, the channel where boring history for sleep turns into a gentle remedy for insomnia and anxiety. Only here you will find the best lulling historical stories that help you fall asleep quickly and deeply. Ancient Rome, the Middle Ages, forgotten civilizations. The whole story is presented as boring as possible, just for sleeping, meditating, or relaxing. Chapter 1. The Beginning of Empires and the Daily Life of Rome and Carthage. An introduction to the soporific story. Welcome to the Boring History for Sleep channel. If you are looking for a background, measured narrative to immerse yourself in a meditative sleep, then you did not come here by chance. This chapter is filled with the lulling silence of antiquity. Our story will be unhurried, detailed, with long names, endless laws, and a slow rhythm of life worthy of the sleepiest nights and lazy matinees. Fundamentals of the slow world, geography. Dawn, times at the beginning of their history. Both Rome and Carthage were simple settlements with patient people. Rome stood on the 7 hills of Latium, surrounded by marshes and quiet pastures where lean sheep grazed. Carthage grew up on the northern coast of Africa, where sand dunes met olive trees in the slow tide of the sultry sea. There was no rush in those centuries. Nature dictated the rhythm. The farmers were waiting for the lazy sun to ripen, when the wine from the sea would blow for the first time, when the abundant dew would gradually come off. They planted and harvested crops with the same slow precision as paper laws are passed. The day began with a long dawn. In the morning, the clink of earthenware jars could be heard slowly. The market squares were filled with inconspicuous movement. Merchants were laying out amphorae with olive oil or pots with spices. Everyday life was a routine in which nothing had changed for years. The old people told the young slow and very long stories about land rights, old treaties, and who built the bridge over the river or brought a new shipment of salt. In every village or city, the year was like a year, and the century was like a century. Rome, the boring grandeur and bureaucracy of everyday life. The Roman Republic became famous not only for its wars, but also for its complex, measured management system. Thousands of laws, meetings, councils, votes, all this took them hundreds of years. Making decisions was not a quick matter and required a lot of arguments, discussions, and haste was avoided. There was a forum in the center of the city, a place where citizens had been talking for centuries, discussing taxes, crops, prices, neighbors' affairs, and emerging contradictions over borders. The senators, dressed in snow-white togas, each discussed what was best for society, stalling for time, postponing decisions. Their conversations dragged on for hours, disappearing into the night, and sometimes never ended. The decision was postponed to the next meeting. The Republican government was very slow. It divided the population by classes, property qualifications, and clans. There were patricians, plebeians, freedmen, visitors from other lands, slaves, and for each, without haste, there was a list of rules, privileges, and restrictions. The real wheel of time in Rome moved so slowly that the changes were most often noticed later, after a couple of generations. The monotony of rulers, the change of consuls, and long waiting periods made Roman life measured and sometimes downright boring. Agriculture was the basis of everything. The Romans never tired of repeating the same work in the fields, vineyards, olive groves. They stored grain in huge barns, built new terraces, harvested crops, and started the cycle all over again. Carthage, from the silence of trade to the rhythm of imperial monotony. Carthage, on the opposite coast of the Mediterranean, was the younger brother of the ancient Phoenician city-states. Its first inhabitants were distinguished by the same cautious and unhurried wisdom. They built harbors and markets, accumulated wealth, but always took steps with caution. There was no room for unnecessary haste among them. Trading caravans crossed the deserts for weeks. Camel caravans moved slowly. Ships full of grain and oil waited for months for the wind. Maritime trade was boring, but stable. Every ship left and returned on schedule. Goods were always delivered on time, and if something happened somewhere, it was sorted out for months on the ships of the merchant guilds. The rule in Carthage was no less confusing than in Rome. To suffects, numerous councils, commissions, lists, ancient scrolls of laws that did not cheer anyone up. There were also special councils of 100 and for people dealing with judicial and supervisory authorities. Their decisions caused more yawning than excitement. They discussed lawsuits, tax lists, disagreements about butcher shops, or harvest schedules from olive groves. The Carthaginian fleet, the pride of the city, sailed slowly and leisurely along the coast. The sailors were usually experienced, but tired from endless seasons of fighting and trading, and the main concern was not to win at sea, but to wait out the storms and successfully return with a cargo of salt, grain, or wine. At the same time, Carthage's wars with its neighbors were also not particularly quick to resolve. Every year brought with it new alliances, new betrayals, and sometimes new taxes. Everything repeated itself over the years and decades, if Rome versus Carthage. The eternal slow struggle in several centuries BC, an ancient rivalry arose between these two forces. It all started with the First Punic War, the longest and most tedious war in history. 23 years of sieges, slow army movements, and tedious alliances. The siege of one city could take years. The troops of Carthage consisted mainly of mercenaries. They went to war only for the sake of earning money, which made the battles especially unhurried. The Roman army stretched out the battles due to the long period of maturation of citizens for service, military education, and unfunny discipline. The first years of the war were boring and said to repeat the same patterns. Build a new fleet, conduct a blockade, prevent a siege, build a new fleet again, lose again because someone did not take into account the current. Even victory seemed to be a tediously slow process, first to win in Syria, then at sea, and then again to wait several years for a new Senate decision. When the war finally came to an end, both sides were so exhausted by expectations, taxes, and fatigue that some victories looked like defeats, and defeats like new protracted alliances. Nothing happened fast. Every change of power, new reform, or unification, everything required new years of discussions, endless sheets of manuscripts, long explanations to merchants, artisans, senators, suffects, everyday life, customs and rhythms of life, from morning to night. If you moved down the social ladder to ordinary Romans or Carthaginians, their daily lives became even more routine and monotonous. Waking up before dawn, they went to their jobs, some to the markets, some to the ports, some to the fields. In such everyday life, nothing changeable happened for weeks and months. The lunch break was firmly anchored by tradition, warm bread, wine, slow conversations about politics, which were immediately forgotten in order to return to the workshops or to everyday worries. The evening brought the silence of the streets, the fading noise of the markets, the glow of oil lamps on the walls of modest houses. In winter, everything became even slower. The hills were covered in haze. The embers of the fires were accumulating in the house. The pack animals were cooling down. Chickens and goats were dozing. And in the distance a lonely howling dog could be heard. Vi. The hilarious drudgery of the ancient economy, speaking of trading classes. It is impossible not to mention the enormous number of taxes, fees, duties, and special orders that regularly change the face of trade, but in fact only increase the paper pile. Permits, licenses, all kinds of debt collection boxes, tax inspectors who counted pots and sacks of grain. The entire economy was rolling like a huge, unwieldy boulder, and every step led to a new cycle of verification, confirmation, and official go-ahead. Merchants have been setting the same prices for decades in order to get permission to export wheat outside the city. It was necessary to wait 3 seasons for an answer. V. The boring utopia of oblivion at the end of the first chapter, I would like to plunge into the cozy silence of the established age-old order. Everything happens here slowly, thoroughly, with respect for tradition and the law of slow generational change. Every morning, every noon, and every evening is similar to the previous one. The stories of the elders that pass from mouth to mouth are gradually turning into laws. Discussions about new reforms are based on the same principles that grandfathers and great-grandfathers discussed. People live yawning about future wars, worrying about taxes, which may someday be reduced. But they are in no hurry to change anything. This is not just a boring history for sleep. This is a chronicle of a slow-motion world where there is no rapid change, where even wars are protracted and reforms are infinitely slow. Let these pages become the perfect backdrop for your sleep. If you've read to the end, you've probably already managed to immerse yourself in the soothing gloom of ancient boredom. In the next chapter, we will take our time. 25 new characters are waiting for you in an even slower, viscous story about the social order and the secret life of Roman and Carthaginian cities. Used for repairs. Chapter 2, Wars and Allies. Punic conflicts and the geopolitics of the Mediterranean Eye. Carthage. The structure of power, the army, and the background of the conflict. Carthage's role in the Mediterranean was unique. This city-state, located on the shores of modern Tunisia, has long been the main trade, economic, and military point of intersection of cultures and interests. The Mediterranean winds brought here not only ships with salt and wine, but also gossip about military preparations, problems of political reforms, protracted negotiations, and endless disputes between trading houses. Power in Carthage was concentrated in the hands of Tisophax, a kind of lifelong rotating leaders, something like consuls in Rome. They shared executive functions among themselves, but resolved issues slowly. relying on 3 councils. A council of elders of 300 people, an executive committee of 30 people, as well as a special council of 104 people, whose task was to monitor and judge slowly, thoroughly, often for several years on one issue. Democracy in Carthage was essentially limited. Popular assemblies were infrequent, and the richest dynasties had a real influence on the city's governance. As always happens in the bureaucratization of society, the more complex the structure, the more workers had to be hired to control the employees who were already working, which made the city a ponderous system that reacted slowly to external threats. The Carthaginian army also differed in its design features. It was recruited mainly from mercenaries, which was the difference between Carthage and Rome, where the legions were staffed by citizens. The Carthaginian army was multinational, assembled and armed with the latest antique technology of the time. Greek shields, African spears, Spanish swords, and Numidian-like cavalry. The main striking force consisted of war elephants and heavy infantry Libyans. The system of involving allied tribes was so complex that only long lists of treaties with Libyans, Numidians, Iberians, and even Greeks have been preserved in the annals. The Carthaginian navy was a separate source of pride and care, more than 300 warships manned by both slaves and free people. He was constantly on alert, subordinated to the Sophites personally through a chain of trusted commanders. Unsurprisingly, the suppression of uprisings within the state, especially slave and tribal ones, was almost an everyday ritual. Soon after any siege or unpopular law, resentment grew in the vicinity of Carthage, and the troops had to oust the discontented from the quiet plains again and again. Rome and its expansion towards world domination parallel to the growth of Carthage, Roman expansion was slowly but surely taking place in Italy. The peculiarity of Rome at that time was its incredible patience and tendency to subordination of the expanding territorial system. The basis was civic duty, strict discipline, and, of course, the habit of constantly discussing one's role in the world at meetings of the Senate, the Commission, and the committees, which became more and more numerous every year. The Roman army, unlike the Carthaginian army, was civilian. Military service was considered the duty of any able-bodied citizen. The training was recorded in the annals. The service lists were kept carefully. All this was accompanied by the exhausting drudgery of paper correspondence and a long-term cycle of distributing and collecting weapons. Marches, sieges, and the construction of camps and forts were not so much weather events as a recurring cycle from year to year. Power belonged to the people, but was actually exercised through magistrates. Magistrates were elected at people's assemblies, and public feasts were held on every occasion, and gifts were given to the voters. The Romans patiently tolerated even ineffective magistrates, taking special pride in their stable republic. Colonies based on lands taken from enemies grew, slowly instilling laws, orders, and culture all the way to the Spanish foothills. There were colonies without real self-government, just in the form of fortified settlements for the convenience of military control. Municipalities, cities with limited autonomy, were required to send troops of soldiers to Rome, pay taxes, and participate in elections for a unified future for the whole of Italy. The beginning of conflicts, the First Punic War and the long-awaited conflict against this background, a decades-long conflict was brewing between the two ancient superpowers. The trigger was a whole chain of local Greek conflicts in Sicily. In 260 for BC, when the Mamertines, former impostor mercenaries, captured Syracuse, their opponents turned to Carthage and Rome for help at the same time. When the Romans first landed in Sicily, it quickly became clear that victory would not be given to the quick, but to the patient and stubborn. Offensives gave way to sieges, followed by long months of surrender negotiations. Major cities changed hands, an atmosphere of heavy and sluggish reporting persisted behind the scenes of the Senate. It soon became clear that it would be impossible to defeat Carthage by land alone. Its fleet blocked the entire island and took control of the trade routes. The Romans built their own fleet from scratch under the guidance of Greek craftsmen and began to advance at sea. But even here it was not without long failures. After the first victories, sometimes the entire flotilla was swept away by a storm, and everything returned to the state of a multi-way boring siege. The war lasted 23 years. Neither side could believe that the end would ever come. For decades, armies clashed in the same valleys. The cities of Sicily changed hands several times. The war turned into an epic of tenacity and exhausting confusion. If stagnation, or the art of political pause, the diplomatic part of the conflict was no less protracted. Rome became an agrarian power, but had to develop a fleet in order not to yield to the pressure from the maritime empire of Carthage. New taxes, reforms, centuriate commissions, and land redistribution were introduced. All this was cooked in a slow parliamentary broth. The centuriate reforms stratified people into new owners and have-nots, but the real changes spiraled slowly, playing out frequent negotiations, short uprisings, and exacerbation of class conflicts. At that time, Carthage lived in expectation. After each failure, it restored the fleet, reviewed taxes and laws. After the defeat of the troops in Africa, the financial and demographic situation of Carthage became so difficult that a major uprising of mercenaries and tribes broke out, and it had to be suppressed with incredible exertion of all forces, long negotiations and concessions. The longer the conflict dragged on, the more it became a matter of habit for both sides. The Romans improved the tactics of war on land and at sea. The Carthaginians updated the bundles of treaties with the Libyans, the sequence of payments of salaries to mercenaries, increased the staff of officials involved in the slave trade and tax collection results in a smooth transition to the next era. The First Punic War ended in a compromise. Carthage retained a significant part of its trading possessions, but ceded Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica to Rome. The tension did not subside. Both sides were dragged into a routine of squabbles, uprisings, protracted negotiations, mutual threats, and concessions. The following century was filled not so much with rapid changes as with a progressive, inevitable, viscous shift in control over islands, seas, lands, and human destinies. Life went on as usual, both in the huge councils of Carthage and in the ponderous commissions of Rome. Decisions were made slowly, thoroughly, And each new cycle of war, peace or rebellion, became a new reason for a long sleep under the rustle of parchment and the sloping of military boots on the slowly trampled streets of ancient cities. Between gastronomy and geopolitics, Carthaginian and Roman daily life in major cities, be it Carthage or Rome, was a routine of chores, intrigues, and constant unrest. Merchants on the forums, craftsmen on the artisan streets, cupbearers in rich houses, and slaves in the fields and shops, all this made up the dense fabric of ancient life. Carthage was famous for the luxury of feasts, the morning noise of markets, and the strange smells of fish spices wafted from the workshops where slaves and artisans from the occupied countries worked. Ships flocked here every day, bringing tons of bread, wine, spices, and fabrics. Horses, butter, and cheese were traded in the central square, while the wealthy Carthaginians made deals negotiated over days of feasting. Ordinary people stood in line to bag or work for new magnates. In Rome, however, there was a special discipline. The branches of government stretched from the Senate to the centuriates, from magistrates to the tribunes, from city officials to the poor and well-to-do citizens. Here, every morning began in droves in the forum, where contract slaves and workers were looking for casual earnings. The lifestyle was a little less luxurious, a little more severe, but no less layered. The telefunctional features of the ancient economy manifested themselves in every corner. Technical innovations were juxtaposed with primitive tools, and exotic Sophia products found their way to the tables of the Roman aristocracy in increasing quantities with the development of trade. Gradually, everyday life itself became part of an ideological struggle. Whose olive oil is better, whose wheat is cheaper, whose bread is more magnificent. These everyday details reflected the state of the economy and society from which the great wars were born. The virtuosity of the Roman and Carthaginian bureaucracy, the routine of life, was also reflected in the bureaucracy. The volume of documentation, the interconnectedness between institutions, the complexity of text reports and minutes of allied meetings were sometimes so cumbersome that the chronicles of these years can be compared to a frozen sea of parchment waves. Every new military commander, every magistrate and suffet in Carthage and Rome was required to account for every coin spent, every piece of bread, and every loan commitment. This led to slow, viscous decision-making, both economic and military. Chronicle of the Punic War, from Sicily to the conquest of the seas. The clash in Sicily is the beginning of a long struggle. Sicily was a real field of wonders for ancient politicians. Here, among olive groves and vineyards, the interests of Carthaginian merchants, Greek emigrants, and Roman consuls clashed. The capture of the city of Messina, the place where the roads of the Mamertines, Syracuse, and the Carthaginian garrisons intersected, became the formal reason for the first war between the Romans and the Carthaginians. The first war, the long siege, naval reforms. When Rome's first legions set foot on Sicilian soil, they faced not a quick victory, but years of grueling sieges. City after city changed hands, and between sieges, the armies of both sides were exhausted from epidemics, food shortages, and constant internal strife. At the same time, the Romans realized that it was impossible to fight without a strong fleet. Following the example of the Greeks, they created the first large naval squadron. This step led to innovations like Raven's longboarding bridges that turned naval combat into a land battle right on deck. On land, the successes were variable. The capture of fortresses, long negotiations with the Allies, attempts to appease or intimidate the locals. Each campaign became a test of endurance, because the real enemy was not only someone else's soldier, but also his own fatigue, weakness of supply. The change of military fortune and the uprising of mercenaries. Carthage did not stay away from the difficult situation in the rear territories. Frequent uprisings by mercenaries supported by Libyan tribes turned even the time of peace into a series of suppressions of riots. The loudest uprising began after the defeat in the war with Rome. Carthage, recently an empire, found itself in the position of a state forced to pay an indemnity and cut costs for its own citizens. As a result, there was less meat and wine on the streets, and the bread queues were getting longer. The Roman state, colonies, allies, features of the social structure, new lands. New contradictions with each new conquest. Rome was faced with the need to integrate new territories. The colonies served as strongholds for the army and for the local peoples as symbols of the changed government. The procedures of assimilation, granting citizenship, and resolving issues of self-government were all difficult to resolve, with endless appeals to the Senate and combined commissions. Social ladder and class struggle. The status of a citizen opened the way to Roman privileges, participation in elections, meetings, and land allotments. However, many residents of dependent cities had been waiting for this status for centuries, and some remained without the right to vote even when they had to maintain legions or pay taxes in full. The reforms announced by the people as tribunes, the creation of new colonies, the redistribution of land, the abolition of debts, caused periodic outbursts of civil activity, protests, and unrest. This led to internal polarization, especially during the years of crisis, when certain families with finances and lands concentrated their influence on the territory, and landless citizens and allies looked increasingly deprived. The crisis of Hellenism and the rise of Roman hegemony, foreign policy games, and the end of the era of city-states while the Romans and Carthaginians were competing in the West. The East was playing its own power game. The Hellenistic monarchies, which had experienced a surge after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, were now teetering on the brink of wars and civil strife. The crisis in Ptolemaic Egypt, the flight of the nobility from the lands, the weakening of trade in Asia Minor and Greece became the soil on which Rome began to think of itself as a world arbiter. Rome's victory on sea and land as a result of long campaigns at sea, naval reforms, and army innovations allowed Rome to take a dominant position. Victories on land were combined with naval blockades. As a result, Carthage was forced to abandon its claims to dominance over the western Mediterranean. The consequences of the war and the transformation of society economy. Increasing competition and the growing socio-cultural crisis. The end of the Punic War turned into a difficult evolution for the winners and losers. Rome got not only gold, housing, and machinery, but also masses of captive slaves, a factor that radically changed the structure of labor relations and the market. Large latifundia appeared, where the labor of dozens and hundreds of slaves displaced free peasants. This led to lower wages, the ruin of small landowners, and the formation of a new poor, a kind of antique proletariat. Territorial integration and new conflicts after the war, it was necessary to establish governance in the new provinces. This meant an endless series of reforms. The redistribution of territories, the creation of new unions and colonial systems. Each of these measures caused misunderstanding and from time to time outbreaks of riots or protests. It was necessary to constantly review civil rights, resolve conflicts between veterans and local residents, urgently build roads, forums, military camps, smooth fading, resentment and preparation for a new era. And yet, despite the cyclical crises, wars, changes of power and alliances, the great Mediterranean was surprisingly slow and difficult to change its historical skin. No triumph became a point of absolute rupture with the past. New reforms, new territories, new laws invariably collided with habits, traditions, and customs. The history of the Roman-Carthaginian conflicts turned out to be not so much a series of battles as a giant slow sea of contradictions, where each current was secretly preparing another storm. Chapter 3. The Transformation of the Mediterranean. The rise and fall of the great powers' introduction. From the Second Punic Crisis to global restructuring in the centuries BC. The very character of the Mediterranean civilization changed. The chain of local conflicts between city-states and relatively small kingdoms was replaced by epical wars, which actually predetermined the appearance of Europe in the Middle East for centuries to come. The outcome of these protracted twists and turns was far from obvious at the start. But the finale was the triumph of Rome and the final collapse of many traditional forces that had previously determined the cultural and political balance of the region. The Third Punic War and Rome's diplomatic network. Background of the war. Carthage. Prosperity in new conditions. Paradoxically, Carthage, having lost all its colonies and deprived of the opportunity to build a strong navy and maintain a large army, flourished economically in the short decades after the second defeat. The merchant nobility invested in agriculture and handicrafts. New irrigation systems appeared. Hard-working slaves were imported en masse, and the need for basic products disappeared in the markets. The townspeople once again enjoyed cultural celebrations and lavish feasts. However, it was the economic success of the old enemy that became a cause for concern for the Romans. Politics of Rome, the Senate reforms, and the rise of jealousy. The party of incorrigible supporters of the destruction of Carthage has gained strength in the Roman Senate. They were led by the stubborn and implacable Cato the Elder, who invariably concluded each of his speeches with the famous formula Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This conservative line was opposed only by more pragmatic merchants and part of the plebs, who did not want to bear the burden of new wars. During the same period, reforms were consistently carried out in Rome, from Gaius Flaminius' agrarian laws to new laws limiting the super profits of senators and protecting the rights of the lower classes. The new colonies on the northern and southern borders of Italy faced economic contradictions. Internal unrest grew steadily until a slight riot broke out in the depths of the Italian prefectures. The emergence of a pretext for war. manipulations and first skirmishes in the late 150s BC. The vassal Numidian king Massinissa, encouraged by Roman senators, began to seize the truncated lands of Carthage, provoking minor armed conflicts. Attempts at peaceful diplomacy only led to increased Roman pressure. Any armed skirmishes were interpreted as a direct violation of the terms of the truce signed following the Second Punic War, when Carthage was forced to abandon independent diplomacy. The new demands of the Senate, the disarmament of Carthage, the transfer of hostages, and relocation outside the city actually made compromise impossible. The siege and fall of Carthage, the beginning of the siege general mobilization when it became clear that Carthage was in imminent danger of destruction. A general mobilization was announced in the city. For 2 years, the city looked more like a giant camp. Forges were constantly working. Weapons and arrows were forged. Ballistae were being built. Even women and children, under the watchful supervision of the authorities, carried stones to fortifications and repaired walls. The Carthaginians showed wonders of resilience. Neither hunger nor disease nor the suffocating sea of corpses under the walls undermined the fighting will of the defenders. Relief of the blockade. Carthaginian engineering and heroism. The key episode was the construction of a secret fleet in a secluded harbor. In a matter of months, residents built 36 warships to try to break through the naval encirclement. In street battles, after the breakthrough of the Roman army led by Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus the Younger, every house turned into a fortress, every street into a fire trap. Only captivity or death awaited the surviving defenders. Final ruin and symbolic rituals after the fall of Carthage. The most terrifying action followed. By order of the Senate, the city was burned, the ruins were leveled, and an iron plow was passed over the ashes, as a curse for anyone who dares to rise up against Rome. The former African metropolis was transformed into an ordinary province. A special place in this story is occupied by the drama of the last days of the city. The elders died on burning roofs. The priests burned themselves in the temple, and women and children were subjected to new taxes, which gave rise to another round of conflicts. Land reforms, agrarian laws, and protracted social wars. The eternal question of land, farms, latifundia, slaveholders. The land issue was fundamental to the entire ancient economy. After the war with Carthage, there was less and less free land in Italy, and most of it belonged either to Roman magnates or to new people who managed to buy ruined possessions. The plebs demanded a second partition, limiting the size of estates and allotment of land to veterans or even the urban poor. In response, the aristocracy creates its own property right, strengthening it through the Senate, clans, and the influx of slaves. This struggle gave rise to constant reforms. The agrarian law of the Gracchi brothers attempts to limit the amount of cultivated land and projects to create new colonies. Unreasonable amounts of grain, silver, gold, animals, slaves, fabrics. Tax collection turned into a profitable business. Tax collectors, publicans, organized auctions to obtain the rights to collect taxes. In Rome, Such companies were called societas publicanorum by analogy. Farmers often exceeded the requirements. For this reason, a lot of private farms quickly went bankrupt. Huge possessions passed into the hands of the Roman nobility. Against this background, financial institutions flourished. The argentari appeared, ancient money changers and bankers who were engaged in storing, exchanging money, providing loans, and international transfers. The Argentarians were loyal allies of the publicans, kept accurate books, and handled transactions on forums and markets. Freed slaves and foreigners often became moneylenders. Roman patricians considered it shameful to engage in such a trade in public. The eastern provinces were distinguished by an extraordinary breadth of credit transactions. Loans at 2,050 per annum, mortgages on land, and trade financing made fortunes. But they also drove the masses of Greeks and Macedonians into debt slavery. The accumulation of capital, gigantic flows of coins, constant inflation and deflation were reflected in the politics and conquering practices of Rome. A variety of forms of government. Laws, provinces, and the crisis of the republican apparatus when Rome became the owner of gigantic territories from Spain to the eastern Mediterranean. It became clear that the old institutions were completely unprepared for effective governance. Each new governor arriving in Italy, Greece, Spain, Africa, or Asia Minor introduced his own rules. There was no single codified provincial legislation, and provincial edicts were rewritten. The cities were divided into categories: contracting, free, tax-paying, exempt, according to privileges and duties. Some associations required military assistance only in case of war. Others had to feed the Roman camps all year round. Loyalties often crossed. Someone had to field warriors, someone had to feed and buy horses for the legions. The system of magistracies, consuls, praetors, and tribunes acquired a complex, stepwise structure, divided into categories of higher, lower, and extraordinary. The influence of pontifices, colleges of priests with the power to interfere in the affairs of both Rome and the provinces, increased. Results of the second chapter: the origins of new contradictions, the era of the Punic Wars, and the crisis of the Hellenistic state summed up several centuries of the evolution of the ancient world. Mass slavery, the emergence of agrarian markets, the unprecedented concentration of funds from the ruling elite, the emergence of proletarian strata, and an endless series of uprisings paved the way for a new round of confrontation. The Roman provincial system and its crises after centuries of expansion and conquest. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic already controlled vast expanses from the Atlantic to Syria, from the Scythian steppes to the Palestinian oases. New concepts appeared on the maps of Roman engineers and scribes. Province is a concept that soon became not only a legal definition, but also the basis of a new administrative and economic model of the ancient world. This is what the Roman province looked like in practice. Let us say that Sicily is the first experience of colonial administration. The problem is that the official Roman authorities thought about eternity, and local life dictated its own rules. Year after year, the praetors changed. Each new one revived the previous decrees and came up with fresh ones. The edicts concerned everything: the norms of grain production, tithing, the procedure for court proceedings between the Romans and the locals, the duties of the military station, up to prescribing the pyrotechnic safety of grain barns. Power and law went in circles, and the provincials went from patience to hidden hostility. In other parts of the empire, for example, in Spain there was a system of treaties with cities and tribes. Fotis, somewhere freedom on paper, somewhere outright bondage, or dynamic dependence, which every uprising or raid of the Gauls reduced to zero. In Asia Minor, Greece, and Africa, with the advent of the Roman administration, old civil strife, tribal strife, and the division of the pie between the local elite and Roman henchmen escalated into whole epics of loyalty or betrayal. The larger the provincial government became, the more contradictions were exposed. Provinces could pay fixed taxes, such as stipends, regular payments to the treasury, or tithes from the harvest. Or they could be subject to one-time levies, taxes, advantages, emergency fees, while the taxpayers, artisans, and farmers bore the main fiscal burden. The Roman and local nobility actively competed for contracts to collect taxes and supplies for the army. Such a system literally ate up the local elites. Many townspeople or tribal leaders tried to obtain civil rights or petition for burden relief, often receiving only increased quotas in return. Chapter 4. The Apogee and Decline of the Roman Republic, from Hannibal to the Empire. Boring history for sleep. Introduction. The Age of Iron and the Roman sword. The Mediterranean breathed the heat of the struggle, the ambitions of the peoples, and the heavy horsemen as steps of the legions. The ZI centuries BC is the time when the tiny agrarian city of Rome, which was not inferior in appearance to other Latin settlements, turned into the arbiter of the destinies of civilizations. In this era, historical battles, momentous reforms, and the rise and fall of great states take place. Boring history for sleep. That is what contemporaries might say, tired of endless wars, hustle and bustle, the growth of slave markets, and the heavy share of ordinary people in the boiling cauldron of transformations. Perhaps there would be a skeptic among the millions of slaves, merchants, and officials. What will the chronicles tell us? Everything is written in blood on the stone arches. Everything will happen again. But for us it is a time of extraordinary changes, giant figures, noisy markets, and soldiers sleeping in the dust. Hannibal Barca, hero, demon, legend. Boring history for sleep. The history of ancient Rome is impossible without the enchanting image of the most famous enemy, the Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca. His name has become synonymous with strategic genius and broken will, and at the same time, tragedy. Boring history for sleep, they say jokingly, rereading the monotonous enumeration of battles. But can the voice of a military odyssey written on the fields of the Pyrenees and Lake Trasimeno lull you to sleep? Early years in training. Hannibal, the son of the legendary Hamilcar Barca, was destined to become a warrior from childhood. His father, who returned from the First Punic War with hatred for Rome, made the boy swear at the altar that he would never forgive the invaders. New generations were growing up in Carthage, sitting at the tables of the old merchants, listening to the noise of the markets and the speech of the deer. But only the barges were preparing for the great campaign. The beginning of the war, crossing the Alps in 118 BC. Hannibal, barely 30 years old, launched one of the greatest military campaigns of antiquity. His army, Libyans, Gauls, Numidians, Spaniards, Africans, is moving by the thousands across the Pyrenees and then across the snow-capped Alps, either following in the footsteps of Roman scouts or at random. Driven only by determination and hatred of the enemy. Tactful and uncompromising. Boring history for sleep. But hardly anyone would have fallen asleep among the lucky ones who crossed the snowy passes where elephants fell from exhaustion. Where every morning became the last for hundreds of soldiers. Victories in Italy, Trebia, like Trosmano. Kens Hannibal, like a history trainer, gives the Italians a lesson in horror and courage. Battle after battle, legion after legion, disappear in his path. At Lake Trasimene, the deceived Romans were surrounded and slaughtered, one of the greatest defeats of antiquity. At Cannes, a battle that has become a textbook for all army academies in the world, encirclement, a double blow to the flanks, the complete destruction of the 80,000th Roman army. On this day, Rome's fate seemed to hang in the balance. Young men ran to the temples to make sacrifices, and senators left their homes to volunteer on the walls. Exhausting tactics and the failure of the Carthaginian genius, but Hannibal, having reached all the heights of generalship, turned out to be alone, boring history for sleep. Emboldened by the occupation, the cities of southern Italy were in no hurry to change hands, and Carthage was slow to reinforce, fearing risks and costs. Numerous minor victories were disappearing into the sand. The Romans were replacing legions with new recruits. Senators were discussing not only the fate of the war, but also the harvest of the year and the price of grain in the markets. The Roman provincial system and its crises after centuries of expansion and conquest. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic already controlled vast expanses from the Atlantic to Syria. From the Scythian steppes to the Palestinian oases, new concepts appeared on the maps of Roman engineers and scribes. Province is a concept that soon became not only a legal definition, but also the basis of a new administrative and economic model of the ancient world. This is what the Roman province looked like in practice. Let us say that Sicily is the first experience of colonial administration. The problem is that the official Roman authorities thought about eternity, and local life dictated its own rules. Year after year, the praetors changed. Each new one revived the previous decrees and came up with fresh ones. The edicts concerned everything: the norms of grain production, tithing, the procedure for court proceedings between the Romans and the locals, the duties of the military station, up to prescribing the pyrotechnic safety of grain barns. Power and law went in circles, and the provincials went from patience to hidden hostility. In other parts of the empire, for example, in Spain there was a system of treaties with cities and tribes focused somewhere freedom on paper, somewhere outright bondage, or dynamic dependence, which every uprising or raid of the Gauls reduced to zero. in Asia Minor, Greece, and Africa. With the advent of the Roman administration, old civil strife, tribal strife, and the division of the pie between the local elite and Roman henchmen escalated into whole epics of loyalty or betrayal. The larger the provincial government became, the more contradictions were exposed. Provinces could pay fixed taxes, such as stipends, regular payments to the treasury, or tithes from the harvest, or they could be subject to one-time levies. Taxes, advantages, emergency fees, while the taxpayers, artisans, and farmers bore the main fiscal burden. The Roman and local nobility actively competed for contracts to collect taxes and supplies for the army. Such a system literally ate up the local elites. Many townspeople or tribal leaders tried to obtain civil rights or petition for burden relief, often receiving only increased quotas in return. Over the years, the hero turned gray, the gleam in the elephant's eyes faded, the legions moved again towards the former horror of Italy. Zama. The fateful ending, the final chord of Hannibal's travels was the Battle of Zama 202 BC. Already in the African fields, the young and charismatic Publius Cornelius Scipio, nicknamed African, opposed him. Ere Hannibal conceded, the bet played against him. The elephants, frightened by the Roman traps, trampled their own soldiers. The Numidian cavalry changed sides, and the tough legions closed the ring. It was a defeat of genius, but not of spirit. Hannibal fell, but Rome has learned a single lesson from that war for centuries. There are no insurmountable enemies. The fate of Hannibal. Posthumously after the peace, Hannibal roamed the east for years, teaching the Roman enemies the art of war, building hidden alliances and raising uprisings. They were afraid of him even after death, boring history for sleep, but the Romans remembered and waited for him to reappear from the darkness of history. Punic Wars, consequences and formation of new structures, the destruction of Carthage and Roman expansion. The Third Punic War, 1 for 9, 1 for 6, was marked by an unprecedented siege of Carthage. Months of desperate defense. Women, children, the elderly, the inhabitants of the city forged weapons, built walls, stood on the lines until the last minute. Carthage burned for 16 days, and everything was razed to the ground. A furrow was plowed in place of the city as a sign of the curse. The surviving inhabitants were turned into slaves. Rome's last great competitor in the region, boring history for sleep, disappeared, but the fire of military hostility broke out elsewhere. Joining provinces: Spain, Macedonia, Asia. With the destruction of Carthage and the defeat of Macedonia in a series of wars until 146 BC, Rome became the undivided master of the Mediterranean. Spanish tribes resisted subjugation for decades. Cities were starved. Macedonian nobility migrated to Italy, and Hellenistic rulers ceded lands to Roman aristocrats for security guarantees. The ancient world became the internal market of the Roman ruling elite. Slavery and markets. A boring history for sleep about slave markets. Hundreds of thousands of slaves from Carthage, Macedonia, Spain, Greece, Gaul, Sicily, Egypt filled the markets of the great city. Boring history for sleep, but these everyday auctions decided much more human destinies than battles. Latifundia grew. Prices for people fell. Even the Hellenistic kings could not hold back the pressure of Roman tax collectors or local moneylenders, turning once free policies into semi-dependent enclaves of debt and encumbrances. The crisis of republican institutions and mass uprising, social reforms and political struggle, the transformation of Roman society followed an escalating line of conflict. The attempts of reformers like the Gracchus brothers Tiberius and Gaius turned into a civil war. Reforms on the division of land, the restriction of slavery, and the introduction of social guarantees provoked fierce resistance from the Senate and provincial nobility. A new phenomenon has appeared in Rome: armed gangs, political assassinations, homicide between the plebs and the canned goods. The Spartacus Rebellion and its impact. The Great Revolt of Spartacus 7371 BC culminated in the fear of slaves. The rebellious gladiators, uniting tens of thousands of slaves under the banners, marched across Italy, ravaging the latifundia, defeating legions, fighting for their freedom and against the inhumane system. Even the boring history for sleep won to obscure the drama of these events. Rome trembled, the slave market emptied, and many rich families fled their villas to fortified cities. In the end, through the efforts of Crassus and Pompey, the uprising was drowned in blood. Thousands were crucified on the Via Appia, tens of thousands were executed. The slave movement was crushed, but fear and hatred remained. The results of the era: boring history for sleep. In the roots of empire, the economy and the state apparatus as a result of constant expansion. Requisition: an increase in the number of provinces, and the rapid growth of slavery. The Roman state apparatus turned into a clumsy machine unable to cope with the flow of taxes, markets, court cases, and political unrest. Praetors and proconsuls ruled dozens of nations, but did not know their language, culture, and needs. Provinces were easier to ruin than to develop. Beggars grew up in the Italian hinterland, and in the new possessions the lords became more and more divorced from the reality of their subjects. Crises, wars, and the decline of the Republic. By the end of the EI centuries BC, the Roman Republic was experiencing a crisis of all institutions. Roman troops were fighting against each other more often than against barbarians. The Senate and the horsemen are mired in corruption. Attempts at reform turn into rebellions and dictatorships. Sulla, Mari, Crassus, Pompey, and later Julius Caesar. Trade, including slave markets, funnels money from the provinces into the pockets of hundreds of families in Rome. The patience of the masses is running out. From boring history for sleep. In the age of empire, thus, boring history for sleep, with its series of celebrations, feasts, electoral posters on forums, executions and circuses, and lawsuits over debts and inheritances, completes the age of the Republic and gives way to the era of empire. Augustus and his successors reorganized the state, create a national bureaucracy, useful roads, schools, the army, and taxes, but on the ruins of the former political democracy. Conclusion: the echo of the great century and boring history for sleep against the background of the rumble of campaigns, the change of epochs, intrigues and tragedies. The ancient world falls asleep in disputes over lands, slaves, taxes, and the rights of peoples. The concepts of justice and res publica lose their outlines. All that remains is the noise of currencies, the heaviness of markets, the formations of legions, and the voices of historians recording boring history for sleep for future generations. After all, it isn't a calm routine in repetitive descriptions of markets, debts, taxes, and claims to power that the great era is born, experiencing its own boring history for sleep.